Hi everybody, welcome to the Parallel Systems broadcast. It's our Sunday night live stream, although it's not a regular time slot for us to do a live stream, but I thought I'd jump on and give you all an update as to what I think is happening in this crazy world. And yeah, it seems like going into this weekend, things really are hotting up now, which is something that I predicted all along would happen going into the end of the year towards the elections. We expected there would be events, there would be wars and rumors of wars, as the Bible told us. Well, there's certainly a lot of that going on right now. Iran are preparing to do a counter-attack against Israel, and it's said that they will actually target civilian entities. So we don't know what's going to happen. Could happen tomorrow, could happen Tuesday. But it seems to me this thing is growing legs, arms, wings, and fangs. It's getting bigger and bigger, and it's not going away. Now, in terms of the US economy, finally, we are seeing some of that economic data that tells us the US is heading into recession. Now, I've been saying since pretty much spring that the US was already in recession. However, it doesn't matter what I say. What matters is what the financial media says and what the pundits say and what the dodgy, doctored information and data that they give out says. And of course, they've managed to convince people that everything was a-okay. However, I always said, and I just had actually my monthly investors call with my group investors who have been through my group coaching with me every month to talk about what's happening, how we're positioning ourselves. And just last month, I told them all that I think we're going to find out that we're in recession very shortly. I think there's going to be lots of bad earnings data coming out going over quarter two and into quarter three, and that would tell people that all of this dodgy data they've been giving us is not actually true. The businesses are not doing well. Unemployment is then going to spike. There's going to be wave after wave of bankruptcies for businesses with weak balance sheets. Of course, the bigger ones will survive, but there will be a huge pullback, and that's exactly what started to happen. Now, let's begin by talking about an indicator. It's called the SAM rule. The SAM rule is when unemployment rate rises by 0.5 percentage points or more relative to its low in the previous 12 months. And you can see here that the Fed actually follows this themselves. It's called the real-time SAM rule recession indicator. And you can see this thing is about as solid as you're going to get as a recession indicator. It's literally hit every single one. 1960, 70, 75, 80. There was that double recession. 1990. And you can see this is where we are now. We are over the threshold. So we're in the 0.53 range in terms of unemployment. So that was one of the indicators that people have been referring to now, saying, oh, wow, the SAM indicator is telling us that we might be heading into recession. Now, of course, the financial media is telling everyone, don't worry, guys, the recession might not happen and it might not come until 2025. We're already here. We've been in recession for a long time. Consumer spending has been collapsing all summer. I was showing my investors a report recently by I think it was Restaurant Insights, a very obscure report that only people like myself in my little bunker are actually reading. And it was talking about how over the past year, receipts in restaurants have gone down 30 to 40%, depending on what type of restaurant it was, whether it was fast food or fine dining or more expensive restaurants. It didn't matter. All of them have seen declines between 20 and 40%. Now, those are the kind of things that I look to, the real data, actual hard data, not the stuff that they're spewing out over at the Fed or in the financial propaganda media, because it's all there to basically indoctrinate you into thinking everything's good. And they always realize there's a recession after the fact. They always tell you after the fact. And then what will happen is when they finally admit there is a recession, they'll revise the information and say, oh yeah, we was actually in recession about a year before that. So this is the way it always happens. Now, what did we see this week? Well, here's the unemployment data. I've got it in front of me. You can see July jobs report, unemployment rate jumps to 4.3%. Job gains total just 114,000, and it was meant to be 175,000. That's non-farm payrolls. And this is the impact. So Intel Corporation, they had their earnings come in way under what was expected. It was meant to be 10 cents per share. It was 2. And you can see there was a drop of 31% in a single week. Now, is this something that we should be expecting to happen to the big seven? Because let's face it, that's all we have to look to if we're going to see the stock market collapse. Well, I think we should. However, think about it this way. I was just talking to my clients and we said, even if Apple, for example, even if Apple falls 35%. It literally only goes back to the level it was in April 2023. So it's hardly taking the froth out of the market, my friends. These markets are so warped and twisted out of shape. Even if Apple falls 35% from here, and it's already fallen a good 5, 6, 7%, can't remember the exact number, but even if it falls another 35%, it literally just takes you back to April 2023. So that's hardly taking us back to fair valuation. Now, what do I think is going to happen? Well, firstly, let's just think about how long the average recession lasts. If you go back to 1854. From 1854 to 2020, the average recession lasted 17 months. And in the post-war period, it shrunk down a little bit to around 10 months. But ultimately, it lasts around a year to 2 years. That is the average. However, if you look at COVID and what happened in just the past few years, that recession with COVID in 2020, it lasted 2 months. Now, of course, that's because it was artificially resolved. They literally had a worldwide pandemic, which led to massive stimulus, stimmy checks to the average man and woman. That was helicopter money. They debased the currency at a rate we have never seen before. They took debt to insane levels. We're now at 35 trillion, might I add. And of course, they debased the currency so much that we had this wave of inflation. And look what's happened as well. The world has been in chaos ever since. This is what you call kicking the can down the road. But we're entering that part of town now where you keep kicking the can, you keep kicking the can, and you're starting to see the bad guys. You're starting to see fires. It's looking like all the shops are boarded up. That guy looks like a drug dealer, and there's another man over there crossing the street, and he's got his knife out. That's the kind of part of town we're in now, and we're kicking the can through that part. So things are only going to get worse from here, is my point. Now, is it a coincidence that all of this has started to happen just after we had the Donald Trump assassination attempt? Well, no, I don't think it is. I actually said that I expected that as the economic data got worse, there would be an event that fed into the civil war narrative. Now, why do I think that? Well, a few reasons. Firstly, they've been telling us there's going to be a civil war all year. Even financial analysts like Ray Dalio are saying there's more than a 50% chance. Similarly, I thought they'd need distractions. They'd need to keep people infighting with each other whilst everything else around them burns. And it will burn, of course, in the Civil War narrative. But I'm talking about on a much more important level when we're talking about the global economy, the whole shebang, the banking sector, and global debt bomb as that explodes. So they're going to keep people distracted. There's going to be more things that happen. People are going to be so involved in the culture war. They're going to be talking about whether Olympic boxers have lady parts or men parts and how it's all working down there. That's what they're going to keep people focused on because they don't want people discussing what's actually happening. So like I said, in 2020, the recession only lasted 2 months, but it came at a tremendous cost to everyone. The global economy, the currency, anyone who saves in any of these currencies has been absolutely shafted. And that is, of course, why we are seeing this happen, my friends. Gold is surpassing $2,500 for the first time ever. Again, we've been talking about that ever since the channel started, that as we go into the financial endgame, and that's where we are, we're in the financial endgame right now, people will look back on this one day and say, wow, that was the end. Now, I don't mean it's going to end tomorrow. And I don't mean that they aren't going to bail it out another time. Yes, that's what they're going to do. There's going to be something else, just like in 2020. It'll be massive. It'll be huge. And maybe that's going to be part of what happens with this response with Iran. Or maybe it bleeds out into 2025. But there's going to be something big. And whatever it is going to lead to huge fiscal stimulus. Now, it's going to be intertwined with the economic data and also the markets. So they're going to have to rush to the rescue of the markets. But also to do the kind of stuff they did in 2020 will take even more than that. So what's going to happen to gold? Well, of course, it will continue to rise. I always say there's going to be 2 revaluations in gold. You're living through one right now. So we are living through the first revaluation. And what's going to happen is it will get revalued again and again and again as we go towards the end. Then we have the monetary reset, the financial reset. That's what I've been saying all along is going to happen. And if you can't see it happening, then you've drunk too much Kool-Aid because it's happening all across the world right now. We're living through it. There's a transition that is happening. We're in that transition period. That's why Donald Trump is saying the US is now going to be the home of Bitcoin and crypto. He actually said, why don't we pay off the 35 trillion national debt, which by the end of his presidency will likely be towards 50 trillion if they get that far. He said, why don't we pay it off with Bitcoin, which it's an absurd thing to say, but that's where we're at, because of course that's a key part of the financial surveillance state that they're building. They want people using it, they want people test running it, because they're getting ready for that switch over from the current system to the next system. I think it happens before the end of the next presidency. Probably. We can only say. We don't know how long they can drag it out for. With crisis that stops people from moving, that implements some kind of social controls, martial law, they can slow things right down, and they can have a much greater degree of control over the velocity of money, who it goes to, how it's spent. So we have to expect we're going to see all of that stuff. So going back to the time frame of the current pullback, if this pullback continues going into the election, they may bail it out only temporarily. That's one solution. They may bail it out temporarily, reduce interest rates, maybe it'll have an effect for a couple of months, but ultimately they're going to need a massive wave of stimulus. And until we see that, I think you need to be careful. You need to be very careful. And also, what's it going to entail in terms of events? How big will the event be? And listen, that means it's going to be social chaos. We're already seeing that. If you look across Great Britain right now, we've got riots on the streets, we've got stabbings, we've got children being attacked. It's a nightmare situation, but you can see how it's all been developing for a long time. I foresaw this a decade ago that this is where we'd end up. Now, it doesn't mean that it's going to be unsafe everywhere. It just means that things are going to get worse. They're not going to get better from here on out. They're going to get worse. And of course, in the US, you're going to have an emboldened conservative group. They're going to be tweeting more aggressively. They're going to tell people what they think more openly, because they're going to feel like they've got their savior. That the man who saved, he's the new God. He was chosen by Jesus. And Israel loved Donald Trump. They said he's the most Jewish president that there has ever been. That's what they said about him. So they're going to have Donald Trump in power if he does get in, of course. There could be the old rug pull where actually he doesn't, and that would feed back into the Civil War narrative. But him getting into power will also feed into the Civil War narrative, because people are so divided, my friends, so divided. Never seen it in my lifetime before this bad. And there will be riots, there'll be lots of events that happen, and then, of course, there'll be conflict. The same thing's happening in the UK, although it's around migration, it's around immigration. But ultimately, it all stems from one faction in society, one group in society having themselves and their voices stifled for a long time, being gaslit constantly. And it's really sad, because these people are desperate to have a voice, and they're clinging on to any movement that might give them a greater voice, that seems like it's for them, finally something for us. Sadly, I think that's all part of the plan, and it's going to be weaponized back against them in due course. So you have to be very careful. Crazy times ahead. Now, in terms of a market pullback, the average recession over the past 150 years has been around 35%. But like I said, if Apple falls 35%, it literally just takes us back to April 2023. It's not going to fix the markets. To fix these markets, we'd have to go back around 95%. It would have to be Great Depression type pullbacks, and it could last decades and decades into the future. Ultimately, the whole global financial system, if you want to call it a globe, let's call it the flat earth system, the whole flat earth system, the whole rhombus system, whatever you want to call it, my friend. Don't shoot the messenger. I don't know what it is. I'm trying to figure that out myself, but I've got bigger things to fry right now. Somebody told me recently we was actually living in a giant crater. So we're in a giant crater on a globe. So everyone's right, kind of. We're in this huge crater. We're on a globe, but in a crater. And therefore, there's other land masses outside of the crater, and the moon is a reflection of us, and we're actually one of those craters that we see on the moon. It was a very interesting theory, quite interesting. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about recessions. So the average pullback has been 35%. That's not going to fix anything, but it would terrify people enough to think we need to vote the right person into power, and therefore it seems to me it could line up with this period now. So who would you vote for? If you're worried about your pension portfolio, if you're worried about your investments, you'd vote for Trump. He's got JD Vance, he's got Larry Fink, he's got the Silicon Valley boys. They're going to step in, he's going to deregulate, he's going to help build the surveillance infrastructure, the financial surveillance infrastructure. That's why he's bringing in Vance and all of the Silicon Valley guys. He's one of the group. He's one of the crowd. Unfortunately, I'm sorry to break it to you. Don't hate on me, MAGA guys. You hated on me with Milei, but guess what? Guess what Milei said this week? He's going to implement AI pre-crime investigations. So they're going to build an AI infrastructure that's going to do pre-crime. It's going to analyze people like in the film Minority Report. It's going to analyze who is committing crimes before they even commit them, and then it's going to investigate them and put them in jail. This is what's happening the world over. I lost subscribers for my take on Milei. Those people now are probably buried their head in the sands because they were the useful idiots once more. But my audience that stuck with me, you're not idiots, you're smart, and hopefully you can see what I see in terms of what's happening in the world. I think I've said enough for this one. I did have an interview this week on geopolitics and empire with Mr. Hrvoje Moric, so you can check that one out. Just search geopolitics and empire. It was a 2-hour interview, and we got into many of the geopolitical and there's no other geo, it's just the geopolitics, that's what we got into. And empire, funnily enough. And we spoke about the end times. We spoke about how all of this system is going to unravel. We spoke about BRICS versus the West and what we think about that is legitimate. And we also spoke about hope and about why there is lots of things to be hopeful for in spite of everything that's happening. So if you need a little bit of hope on your Sunday evening, you can check out that interview. Also, please head over to my Patreon if you want to support my work. I do a weekly newsletter, there or thereabouts. It's pretty much every week. I go into what I'm speaking about on the channel much more in depth than I give my most speculative and controversial takes that I can't say on the channel for obvious reasons. So if you really want to be up to speed on what's going on, that is the place to be. Also, I put out a lot of homesteading content on there. I show people what's going on over here on the farm. And we talk about simply getting ready for the harder times. But of course, there's a key part of that is about knowing what is really happening in the world and analyzing it in a way that is not filled with lies and propaganda, which sadly is most people. How many people dropped the ball on Milei? How many people are dropping the ball right now? Too many. Way too many. So if you're interested in finding out more, you can check out the Patreon. In closing, take care of yourselves. Please give this video a like, share it wherever you think it needs to be shared. Take care of yourselves, enjoy the rest of your evening, and I'll see you all, hopefully, in the next one.